all the people who have journeyed to America from foreign lands, African Americans have the saddest yet most inspiring story. They came as captives sold into involuntary servitude by European slave traders. By 1890, the promise of freedom won during the Civil War had soured as new oppression took root. After Reconstruction and the withdrawal of federal troops from the South, blacks found themselves at the mercy of a hostile white population that subjected them to discrimination, mob violence, and left them with few economic alternatives. Voting laws were passed that effectively silenced blacks. In time, prejudicial laws would extend into other realms, namely schools and public transportation. These combined policies were known as Jim Crow laws. This system advocated a policy of maintaining separate but equal schools, transportation, and housing for the races. But in truth, conditions were not equal.
It meant that there was a school for black people and a school for white people. And the school for white people would be better than a school for black people. It meant that black people could not use the public library. If they were lucky, there would be a colored library, but it wouldn't be as well endowed as the white library. So this would go on throughout life in Southern society.
Jim Crow was tested in the historic case Plessy versus Ferguson. Arrested in 1896 for refusing to move from a whites-only compartment of the East Louisiana Railroad line, Plessy challenged his conviction on the grounds that it violated his rights under the 14th Amendment.
The doctrine separate but equal was the philosophical underpinning of the Jim Crow laws, and it really took on life as a result of the famous Supreme Court case Plessy versus Ferguson.
After Reconstruction, the first African American to rise to national prominence was Booker T. Washington. He organized and dominated a national network of African American self-help organizations, businesses, and communities. Washington was best known as the founder of Tuskegee Institute, an industrial school located in Tuskegee, Alabama.
He believed that blacks needed to learn industrial skills in order for them to advance and to survive in American society as free people. Blacks were only free in the South from 1865, that was 30 years, and he believed that industrial training would be appropriate for black advancement at that particular time.
Booker T. Washington faced his fiercest opposition from other African Americans, including a Harvard-educated intellectual named William Edward Burghardt Du Bois.
Well, Du Bois, of course, was northern-born. Washington was southern-born. They were both the elite of the race, that is, that they were middle-class blacks, elite blacks in the truncated hierarchy of black society. But they were as different as night and day in terms of social philosophy.
Du Bois became Harvard's first African-American PhD. In 1909, Du Bois joined with leading white reformers to create the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, an organization committed to the elimination of segregation and other forms of discrimination. Throughout the 1890s, African Americans were shot, burned, and lynched by racist whites at an alarming rate. Like the fugitive slaves of an earlier generation, African Americans fled north for safety, but in far greater numbers.
Groups like the Ku Klux Klan were attempting to take away the rights that had been gained by African Americans. And rather than continually deal with violence and abuse, many families decided, we'll just move. We'll go someplace where we can get a good start and we won't have to constantly worry about this kind of thing. And so people moved for a better life. better opportunity.
Fearful for their own jobs, some Northern blacks resented the new migrants and refused to admit them into fraternal organizations, churches, social clubs, and other community groups that could have eased their transition into city life. Instead, the new arrivals were forced to fend for themselves in an alien and often hostile environment. In time, the antagonism between established blacks and newcomers diminished. A turning point in unifying the diverse African American population came with World War I. By war's end, nearly 367,000 African Americans were called into service, many overseas. Veterans returned home from the foxholes of France with a new outlook. Europeans often treated them equally as Americans. The soldiers had discovered that it was possible to live in a society free from racial discrimination.
And when they came home after the war, after having given all that they could, many of them having lost their lives, they were not going to accept being treated as if they were less than first-class citizens. I mean, many of them were wearing the American uniforms in their hometowns, and yet they were challenged just by walking on the street. You know, they were insulted, they were degraded, and they fought back like they never did before because things were different as far as they were concerned.
At this time, Marcus Mosiah Garvey began to capture the attention of African Americans. He believed whites would always be prejudiced against people of African descent. In 1914, Garvey founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association that later served as the base for his Back to Africa movement. The UNIA's message of political liberation and African nationalism struck a chord with African Americans. In its earliest days, the UNIA aimed not to relocate blacks, but to heighten black pride and to introduce a program of educational and economic opportunity.
Whereas segregation had been a negative, Garvey said, oh no, it's the greatest thing that's happened, because in that separation and segregation, we can build our strength. And Garvey took the argument of race farther than anyone else had, except perhaps some racist Southern governors, and made black not only beautiful, but superior, and then tacked onto it a concept of Zionism, out-migration to Africa.
During World War II, approximately 1 million black men and women served their country with distinction. Although they still faced discrimination, they did gain entry into more branches of the armed forces than ever before. At home, industrial plants joined the war effort by producing the supplies needed for American troops. But black workers did not share in this new abundance and stood no chance of employment in defense plants controlled by white-dominated unions. In 1941, A. Philip Randolph, the organizer and president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, decided to combat this racist policy. He spread news of a planned march on the nation's capital. President Franklin Roosevelt met several times with Randolph, who agreed to cancel the march if Roosevelt guaranteed to end the discrimination against blacks in the defense industry. On June 25, 1941, Roosevelt made good on his promise by issuing Executive Order 8802, a landmark document in African American history. The order stated that there shall be no discrimination in the employment of workers in defense industries or government because of race, creed, color, or national origin. African American leaders next decided to challenge the principle of segregation. They focused their attack on the public schools of the South, which cheated black children of an opportunity to receive an education comparable to that of white students. In 1951, Thurgood Marshall, the head of the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund, began to develop a case challenging the legality of school segregation. Oliver Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. Marshall won, and the Supreme Court invalidated segregation, paving the way to equal rights for all Americans.
Mostly, I think, his contribution was to encourage people. He was able to communicate the sense that they were moving with history, and that despite the fact that current conditions might be terrible, in the end, the African American community was going to prevail.
He never was sort of an elite type lawyer. He was always a common people's lawyer. He was the kind of lawyer who, with other civil rights lawyers, traveled the back roads of the South, often in very dangerous circumstances, and who, when they did get back up to their offices in New York City or Washington, were very proud of their victories.
In December 1955, Rosa Parks, a black seamstress living in Montgomery, Alabama, refused to yield her seat on a bus to a white man. The bus driver summoned a police officer and had Miss Parks arrested. E.D. Nixon, head of the local branch of the NAACP, in which Miss Parks was an active member, saw her arrest as a golden opportunity to challenge the city's Jim Crow bus laws. They demanded that the city integrate its buses and hire more black drivers. Nixon chose a young minister, Martin Luther King Jr., to lead a proposed boycott of the buses. The boycott lasted more than a year, as black citizens chose to walk rather than ride the buses. The economic drain on the city was so great that city leaders finally caved in and agreed to a compromise. The federal courts intervened and struck down the city's Jim Crow transportation laws. The boycott ended in complete victory, and its leader, Martin Luther King Jr., was elevated to national prominence at the age of 26.
It is a position in which we can well map out the strategy for the future of integration.
I think Martin's greatest gift to me personally was the notion that anything can be changed. We Shall Overcome was more than a song. It was a faith. It was a feeling that you didn't have to accept anything as it was.
He was a phenomenal orator, and I think the impact of his words probably have had as much to do with his significant role as the impact of his deeds in the civil rights movement. And I think it's important that we understand just the role that words can play as opposed to the role that only deeds can play.
King's studies in Boston had introduced him to the teachings of Mohandas Gandhi, a politician and spiritual leader in India. King admired Gandhi's doctrine of nonviolent resistance to oppression as a means of opposing social injustice. In 1960, King began to put his principles into action. He left Montgomery for a pulpit in Atlanta, Georgia, and during that year founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, an organization dedicated to nonviolent protest against segregation. Soon, the black community began staging peaceful acts of civil disobedience, both in conjunction with King and independently. After planning all night in a college dorm room, 4 black students in Greensboro, North Carolina, sat down at a white-only lunch counter in a Woolworth's department store. They sat all day until the store closed, and then the next. Soon they were joined by dozens of others, including some whites. They encountered violence and insult and attracted national attention. Their sit-in resulted in the eventual desegregation of Greensboro's public facilities. In May of 1963, Martin Luther King made the controversial decision to use high school students in his demonstrations. The nation watched in stunned horror as Bull Connor, Birmingham, Alabama's Commissioner of Public Safety, turned fire hoses and unleashed dogs on thousands of black teenage protest marchers. The news footage of the dogs tearing at the demonstrators and of young people being swept away by the torrent of water shocked and moved white Americans. President Kennedy said the pictures made him sick. Negotiations with embarrassed white leaders brought a promise to desegregate public facilities, and the campaign ended in victory. Encouraged by their successes, black leaders planned a huge rally in Washington to protest slow government action in civil rights. The March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom drew national attention. More than 250,000 people came to Washington on August 28, 1963. The most dramatic moment of the event occurred when Martin Luther King ascended the platform to say a few words of his own.
I have a dream that one day we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
But just behind Martin Luther King Jr. was a phalanx of black women and men, people who had been organizing and struggling even before the time that he came to Montgomery, people who had been trying to push against Jim Crow, push against racial oppression. So he was someone, because of his eloquence, who could top their efforts, who could symbolize their efforts as one person. But he had an organization and hundreds of people behind him.
But as blacks made gains, dissension arose within the civil rights community. Some leaders found King's method of nonviolent protest too tame. Others thought the movement should shift its focus from the South and institutional segregation to the North, where blacks had more legal rights but were locked into ghettos and out of decent housing and jobs. The events in Birmingham, the stirring March on Washington, and the November assassination of President John F. Kennedy, who had slowly begun to embrace civil rights, combined to impel Congress toward the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Congress also passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which provided federally supervised voter registration in the South. Thousands of blacks registered and eventually voted. This brought to fruition the seed work done by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee during its voter registration drives. Many African Americans in the North began to express skepticism about the goal of a racially integrated society. They knew firsthand that greater intermingling between whites and blacks did not necessarily end either racism or, more importantly, the poverty that shadowed black communities. African Americans espousing this nationalist philosophy turned for leadership to a black man many regarded as the antithesis of Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X.
But do you really think the white man today is going to vacate his jobs like he vacated his schools and vacated his houses? Whereas the white man could cut out and leave you the house or cut out and leave you the school, the white man just can't cut out and leave you that job. So you're going to have trouble.
Malcolm experienced a spiritual redemption through exposure to the teachings of Elijah Muhammad, founder of the Nation of Islam, or the Black Muslims. Muhammad advocated a rejection of the white culture imposed on blacks by the institution of slavery. Malcolm X joined Elijah Muhammad's ministry and preached to a growing following. His militant sermons drew fire from whites who accused him of igniting ghetto resentments.
It says that your kingdom is divided. It says that your days are numbered. It says that your time is up. And you've been found wanting. Something is missing. You haven't done the right thing by my people. And because you haven't done the right thing by my people, now I got to do the right thing by you. kingdom has got to go.
Malcolm met with disapproval from Elijah Muhammad in 1963 and was suspended from the black Muslims. In February 1965, Malcolm was assassinated by 3 men claiming to be black Muslims. The civil rights movement became splintered and nearly collapsed in the mid-1960s when a rash of rioting broke out in American cities such as Los Angeles, Detroit, and Newark.
I would like for all of us to believe in nonviolence, but I'm here to say tonight that if every Negro in the United States turns against nonviolence, I'm going to stand up as a lone voice and say this is the wrong way.
The crisis culminated in 1968 when King was assassinated in Memphis at the age of 39. More than